Hello, my name is Maddie, and today I'm going to be talking about some of my favorite books that I have read, like required reading for school. So this list is not like of all of my years of school, because first of all, I'm still in school, and second of all, some of the books that I read when I was younger, I actually don't remember. I don't remember reading them. So I'll mostly just talk about books from like 7th grade onward. Although I do have one book that I want to mention from when I was younger that I did read for school. So without further ado, let's get started. And I will start with that one book I mentioned that I read when I was younger. So I don't have any of these books with me currently, so obviously, picture, you know the drill. So the first book I want to talk about is Number the Stars by Lois Lowry? However you say her name. I believe I read this book when I was 10, although it might have been when I was 9, I'm not 100% sure. And it completely changed my life because that was I knew before then that I loved historical fiction. Sorry about the angle change. That was my first foray into historical fiction. Specifically World War II historical fiction. I had always loved historical fiction, but I had never read any World War II historical fiction. That was my first one. And I hadn't learned about World War II. Well, I might have a little bit, but I hadn't really learned about World War II at that point. So when I got to read that book, it was so shocking to me that like people would actually do this to other people, because I guess it just like really hurt that because I had so much faith in humanity when I was younger, that seeing that, the rest of humanity didn't share the same sort of faith sort of really, really impacted me. If you didn't know, this book is about two friends, Anne-Marie and Ellen, and Ellen is Jewish, but they're living in Copenhagen in 1943, so not great for her. I shouldn't make jokes like that. And Anne-Marie and Ellen don't really know what's going on with the war, but Anne-Marie knows that she needs to help Ellen sort of escape the persecution that's coming her way. And it's really amazing to read as a young child, because I was about the same age as they are in the book when I read it. So it was me understanding what they were going through, but also me learning how to understand what this event was that I had that I had heard about, but I didn't know a lot about. Yeah, I guess that's all I have to say. Like I said, I haven't read it in a long time, so that's, I guess, all I really have to say. The next book that I want to talk about is a book that I read in 8th grade, so I was 13. And it was a book group choice book, and that is The Book Thief by Marcus Zusak. And I had already owned this book. I was planning to read it eventually, but I figured because I read it for school, I should include it on this list. And surprise, surprise, it's another World War II historical fiction. That book is about, I don't remember names ever. Why don't I ever remember names? I'm ridiculous. Liesl, that's her name. Okay. So it's about a girl named Liesl who was with her mother and brother, and they were escaping on a train, and then her brother dies. And her mother was going to give her brother and her away to a family to help sort of keep them alive, because she couldn't. But her brother dies, and so it's just her having to go and live with this family. And this is in Germany during World War II, so lots of Nazisms, and sort of like Number the Stars. It was different. It was a different experience from Number the Stars for me, because I already knew what the Holocaust was. I knew what horrors had happened, how that sort of worked, but this was the first book that I'd read from the perspective of someone who was German, and of someone who was surrounded by Nazi propaganda, who was told that it was right. Because in most other World War II historical fiction novels, it's about someone who knows that this is wrong and is trying to fix it. So, Lilac Girls, Lonely War, those are all they're usually set in England. They talk about patriotism and not giving up through Blitzkrieg and all that happened. But this was the first book that I read that was set in Germany, where the main character had to figure out what was right and wrong for herself, and couldn't depend on the world around her to tell her, because they had a very different opinion of what was wrong and what was right. And that was just because, how do you deal with that? I guess up until that point, I had villainized Germans in my head. I had basically said that everyone who lived in Germany was bad. But obviously that's not true, and after reading that book, it was sort of like, that was part of when I lost that childish sense of what's right and what's wrong, right? We all go through that. We all have to figure out good and bad isn't the only thing that's possible. It's a spectrum, right? So you can, and not one person is completely good or completely bad. There's both light and dark inside of all of us, to quote Harry Potter, because how could I not? So that was really important for me to learn. The next book that I read for school, I read this book in 9th grade when I was 14, and that was To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee Burgess. And I loved this book so much. And even though I've reread it recently, I still can't figure out why I love it so much. Akin to most of us when we find a favorite book. It's like, it's not something you can express, it's just that there's something about the book that makes you happy. And I think it was the same way with me for To Kill a Mockingbird, because there was injustice and there was someone fighting that injustice, and there was bullying and there was someone fighting that bullying. And so it was a lot of this family, the Finches, pushing to right wrongs even though they were being sort of outcasted from society. And watching Scout go through that was, like, once again a really important moment, but also very eye-opening, because she just wanted to go with what everyone else in school said because she thought that it was easier, and her father had to teach her that just because it's easier doesn't make it right, and sometimes you have to fight for the right thing to do even though it's hard. Oh my god, I love Atticus Finch so much. I didn't realize this when I first read it, but like I said, I've since reread it. Atticus Finch is the best human, and if you are not like him, what are you doing with your life? Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. To Kill a Mockingbird is a difficult book to explain. If you didn't grow up in the US, you probably haven't read it. If you did, you probably know what it is, because I think it's required reading for everyone in the US at this point. It's about a family called the Finches who live in the South in the 1800s. So racism, blah, blah, blah. And it's about Scout, the main character, trying to figure out racism and sort of like what I talked about with The Book Thief, the good and bad, figuring out that not everyone is completely good or completely bad, and you definitely can't judge, like, judging a book by its cover, you can't judge a person based on the rumors that other people spread about. That's not even judging a book by its cover. That's judging a book based on other people's opinions. She has to learn how not to do that and to figure out that everyone has a side that they don't show anyone, so you can't put everyone in a box, I guess. That was really cool. This is kind of funny because, like, it's gonna go like one book per grade until 12th grade, where I read way too many good books. But I guess that's how it works. So the next book that I read in 10th grade when I was 15 is The Power of One by Bryce Courtenay. And this book is once again hard to explain. It's about a boy named PK living in South Africa during, it's again, World War II. Are we sensing a theme? Well, he grows up, so like World War II ends during the book, because the book is set from when he was a child to about when he's like 20 or 30. So it just sort of follows him and his life, and it is akin to the other books that I've talked about, because it's him discovering, obviously as a coming-of-age novel is, it's him discovering right and wrong and having to come to terms with the fact that not everyone is completely good or bad, and that bad things happen to good people sometimes. And that he still has to stay strong in his beliefs even though bad things are happening to good people, is basically the premise. When I initially read this book, I didn't love it. It was kind of annoying because it was a huge book, and it's like we were reading it really fast, so that like kind of made me annoyed. And then after I'd read it, I told one of my friends that I'd read it, and she was like, oh, I love that book. She didn't have to read it for that class. She read it just for fun because she's weird like that. And she started talking about all the things that she loved about the book, and someone else had already done this who was in my class. And I started thinking about it, and I was like, this book is a lot more than I thought it was. I just wasn't thinking of it in the right way, because like a lot of required reading, I look at it as required, and then I'm like, I don't want to analyze this. But seeing it through their eyes, seeing my two friends freak out about this book, about how much they sort of gained from this experience, made me realize that, yeah, this is actually a really important book, and that it is really important to me that it gets talked about and stuff. And I need to reread it because I don't really remember what happened in it, but that's okay because we all like rereading books. Yeah, I have no idea how to say this name. I'm very sorry I'm about to butcher this, but I'm going to try my best. The next book that I read in 11th grade, so when I was 16, is Americanah by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I don't actually know if that's how it's said. I'm very sorry for probably completely butchering that beautiful name, but as I only speak English and French, that's a little difficult for me to do. This book is about a young woman named Efemelu who had lived in Nigeria when she was younger and moved to the US for university, and then when the book starts, she's in the process of moving back to Nigeria. So it's her looking back on her life, both in Nigeria and in the US, and looking back at her experiences in both countries. And this book, it wasn't like specifically on my curriculum. It was a book that I got to choose to read instead of reading The Grapes of Wrath, which I was very thankful for, because a boring sounding book if I've ever heard one. I had never read something so raw before, because before that book I had only, I never forced myself to read outside of my comfort zone. So I had only read YA, fantasy, contemporary, sci-fi, and I never forced myself to try to read something different. And this book was long, and sometimes I would get a little bored. But after this book, I realized that sometimes that's good for me. Sometimes I need to push myself to read something, even though it might be a little bit boring in some parts, to get through the book, to actually experience its greatness. Because yes, some books are very long, and yes, some books can get a little boring at some points, but that will never deter from the experience as a whole. Or I guess if it's written well enough and the plot is engaging enough to you, that won't deter from your experience about of the book as a whole. And this book, once again, was really amazing to read. This book wasn't about World War II, so we're mixing it up this time. But it was, like, to see this back and forth happening, to see her reflecting on her life, just, I guess, put a spark in my head, because I can't describe it any other way. That's what it did. And I feel like it's really important because a lot of times, probably for a lot of you who grew up in the US, or we're taught to believe that the US is the best country because it has the American dream, because everyone is equal. But first of all, that is definitely not true. And second of all, the US isn't the best country out there. When I was really young, that was what I thought. I thought that, well, maybe not the best country out there, but I did think that the US had some sort of je ne sais quoi that the rest of the countries in the world didn't, and that's why everyone wanted to go there. And now I've realized that that's semi-true, but that definitely doesn't mean that the US is the best country. It definitely doesn't mean that just because you live in Africa, where a misconception is that no one lives in cities, which is something that I believed when I was very young because I was impressionable to the ways I was being taught. But it made me realize that maybe the US isn't all that great. Definitely put that spark in my head. And I'm really thankful for that, because that's something I've tried to continue to stick with, that I have to look at a place subjectively and not just let its whims win me over, I guess. That got really deep and emotional, but this entire video is deep and emotional because I'm tired and sick. But we're gonna keep going. I think I have like 4 more books to talk about. I'm gonna pull out my journal because it helps me remember what the books are. The next book that I read for school was, why am I blanking on everything in my life? This was in 12th grade, but it was still when I was 16, and I read Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. And I have one friend who is completely obsessed with Jane Austen, the same one who read The Power of One just for fun because she's insane. And she had been recommending me Jane Austen for so long, and finally I had to read it for a school assignment. So I was like, fine, I'll pick it up, whatever. And I had sincerely doubted her that that book was this amazing, and that book was that amazing. Oh my goodness. If you haven't read Pride and Prejudice, I don't know what you're doing with your life. Turn off this video, go read Pride and Prejudice, and then you can come back. Okay? Glad we've cleared that up. Pride and Prejudice, if you don't know, which like if you don't, where have you been all of your life because you're missing out, is a cultural phenomenon. I'm living in Bath right now, where Jane Austen wrote a lot of her books because this is where she lived. And this place is filled with Jane Austen culture and it just makes me happy. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about Pride and Prejudice right now. Pride and Prejudice is about a girl named Elizabeth and her sisters. Her mom is trying to marry her off to a wealthy young Englishman because they don't have a lot of money and they only have, the Bennet family, that's what their family is called, they only have daughters, so their only way to get money and status is to marry off their daughters to wealthy, well-known men. Which is not how we like society to go, but that's just how it worked, I guess. So, and Elizabeth and Jane, the 2 oldest, both get involved with some wealthy Englishmen who come to visit their small town. I keep saying wealthy English, like they're all English. It's set in England. But they get involved with these wealthy men who come to their town and are like buying up property and stuff. And it's a beautiful story about judging people by their first impression, judging people by the rumors that you hear, but and then getting to know someone and realizing that you can't judge a person that way. And equality in a time when equality was basically unheard of. And it's just beautiful. And I now need to go and read every single thing Jane Austen's ever written. I own them all. Not with me, but I own them all. And I just need to read them now. That's where we're at. The next book that I read was also by a very well-known British author. I read this in 12th grade, but I read this when I was 17. And that was Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë. And I had thought that in that year of school, my favorite book was going to be Pride and Prejudice. And then I read Jane Eyre. And Jane Eyre was like the best book ever. So Jane Eyre is about a little girl named Jane, and Jane is orphaned. She lives with a very kind relative of hers who took her in and was like, yeah, whatever, you know, she needs a home, so blah, blah, blah. And the story is basically just Jane's life from when she's young to when she's probably in her 30s, like governessing and stuff. And it's, once again, an amazing story about Jane finding her place in a society where all she's supposed to do is get married, and she actually does a lot more than that, or does a lot more before that becomes an important part of her life, and she realizes her own worth before entwining her worth with someone else's, and that was like beautiful to read about, because it's not a common theme in a book set during then, especially a book written during then, so it just made me happy, and I love that book. And if you're watching this and you haven't read that book, turn it off, go read it, and then you can come back. Thank you. yeah, the last book on this list, I also read in 12th grade. I also read when I was 17. And we're going back to our favorite World War II theme, All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. I think that's how you say his last name, D-O-E-R-R. Doerr. Doerr? Something like that. All That We Cannot See is about a girl named Mary Lore who lives in a little French town and is blind. And it goes back and forth between her when she's like 17 living with her uncle during like an air raid in the middle of the night, right at the very end of World War II, and between that and her experience growing up with her father, who is now gone missing. And it also follows a boy character whose name I've just forgotten, and it is, Werner. This book also follows Werner's story, also from when he was younger and when he was older, and it talks about a couple other people too, but mostly Marie and Werner, and it's a beautiful story about bravery and finding what's wrong and what's right from the perspective of a Nazi sympathizer, and he actually is a Nazi because he's in the army, and someone who is doing her best to resist the Nazi regime. And it just, it's a beautiful, beautiful book. It only came out a couple years ago. It won some fancy prize. I don't remember which prize it was, but it won some fancy prize. And it just makes life better when you read it. It doesn't sound like it because it's really sad. It has a lot of really sad moments, but it just, everyone in the world needs to read it. Just everyone in the world needs to read it. That was it for my list of all the books that I have really loved that have been required reading. I'm currently reading 2 books. One of them is actually required reading. So the first one is obviously The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson, because if I wasn't reading this book, who would I be? But I'm now on page 678. So I'm definitely more than halfway through. My goal is to get to read like another 80 pages today. It's like, what time is it? It's like 3:25, so I can definitely read another 80 pages today. My hope would be to get to the end of this book section, but that's another like 200 pages, so I don't know if that's gonna happen. But yeah, and I'm realizing, I guess, how much I love one of the characters, because she wasn't in the last section, and I didn't realize how much I missed her until she came back, and I was like, yes, you, thank goodness. Because she's so witty and fun. And I'm really enjoying this a lot more than I was, I think, which I'm really happy about, because I do genuinely really want to read it, but sometimes it just gets to the point where I'm like, this book is never going to be finished, and I'm sad. But I think I can do it. I think I can finish it. I'm doing pretty good so far. And the other book that I'm currently reading is Elephant by Raymond Carver. So I'm reading this for one of my university classes. I'm on page 90 out of like only 120 something. 124 I have 2 stories though. This is a book of short stories by Raymond Carver, and I have 2 stories left, so I'm doing pretty good. It's due Wednesday, so like not a big deal at all. And yeah, I think this book is alright. It's not amazing. It's a little confusing because the author is very, very straightforward in his writing, so much so that sometimes I can't tell what's going on with the characters. It just sort of feels like he's transcribing the life of someone into like an official document as opposed to actually letting us know what's going on in their lives. And like we see it, the emotional flashes sometimes, but not a lot. And that's hard for me because I depend on character development to enjoy a story, so it was a little bit like, I don't know. But it is, like, it's a solid book, you know. It's better than a couple of other books that I've read for school that I've really hated. But that's another video, so I will make that someday in the future where I'll talk about all the books that I've hated for school. And I think that's it. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have another book that you had to read for school or one of these that you enjoyed, let me know, because I'm always looking for new old reading. I guess. But thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!